My name is Samuel Turner, though most folks around here just call me Sam. I'm 74 years old now, living alone in a small wooden house on the edge of Cedar Hills, Alabama. I spent my whole life as a carpenter, shaping wood with my hands, listening to the hum of saws and the rhythm of hammers. These days, I live off my pension in the quiet joys of simple routines, brewing coffee at sunrise and watching the light fall across the old cornfields every evening. From the outside, my life looks peaceful now. But the truth is, this peace came only after I walked through the biggest storm of my life. A storm that didn't come from the weather, but from the heart of the woman I loved for nearly half a century. If someone had told me 10 years ago that one day I'd be sitting alone in this house, sharing the story of my marriage with strangers, I would have laughed. I thought I knew my wife, Margaret, better than anyone in the world. We built everything together, our home, our children, our dreams. I trusted her as naturally as I trusted my own breath. But then one day, I learned that sometimes the truth hides so deep that even the person who shared your bed for 50 years can turn out to be a stranger you never really knew. I'm not telling this story to complain or to ask for pity. I'm telling it because maybe out there, someone is living in that same quiet confusion, that same hollow ache I once felt. If my story can give even one person a bit of courage to stand back up again, then every painful memory is worth revisiting. So today, if you've got a few minutes to listen, I'll tell you my story. The story of Sam Turner, a simple carpenter who had to learn how to start over at nearly 70 years old. I was born in 1951 into a humble farming family in Cedar Hills, Alabama, where summers burned the skin and winters laid frost thick over the fences each morning. There were 6 of us kids, and I was the third. My father, Harold Turner, grew corn and raised chickens. My mother, Evelyn, was a gentle soul who hummed softly while she cooked. We lived in an old wooden house with a tin roof that rattled every time it rained. Life was poor, but it was warm. I still remember winter mornings when my father lit the wood stove, my mother brewed coffee, and we kids huddled close together for warmth. That kind of happiness, simple, honest, has never left me. I fell in love with the smell of wood when I was 10 years old. One afternoon, my father took me to the workshop of Mr. Hank Dalton, an old carpenter in town. He was sawing through a plank of oak, sunlight streaming through the window, scattering tiny golden sparks. The sound of the saw, the steady rhythm of the hammer, the scent of resin in the air. I stood there, mesmerized, watching those rough hands shape a block of wood into a perfect chair. From that day on, I went to his shop almost every afternoon after school. At first, I swept the floor, stacked lumber, and kept the fire burning in the kiln. Mr. Dalton used to smile and say, "Boy, wood is a lot like people. Some bend easy, some fight you all the way. If you want to understand it, you got to learn to listen." Those words stayed with me for life. When I was 17, Mr. Dalton suffered a stroke in his workshop and passed away. I can still hear the dry thud of his hammer hitting the floor that day. His wife later sold me all his tools, told me to pay her back little by little, no interest. I worked from dawn till dusk, teaching myself how to measure, cut, join, and polish until people in town started coming to me. They used to say, "That Turner boy builds chairs sturdy enough for the Lord himself." I never knew if it was a joke or a compliment, but I took pride in it. To me, if my name was going to be on something, it had to be solid, honest, just like the life I wanted to live. And that's how I became a carpenter, a craft I've never walked away from, no matter how much the rest of my life would change. It was 1973, and I was 22. My small carpentry shop had started to earn a good reputation around town. I wasn't rich, not even close, but I was doing what I loved, and back then that felt like enough. At least it did, until the day Margaret Wells walked into my workshop. It was an April morning. The door stood open, sunlight catching on the dust motes floating in the air. Then a soft voice called out, "Excuse me, can you help me?" I looked up and there she was, Margaret. She wore a pale blue dress and held a little chair with one broken leg. "I teach at the elementary school," she said. "The kids broke this chair. They told me you're the best carpenter in town." I laughed, a bit shy but proud. "The best? Well, seeing as I'm the only one, I guess that makes it true." She laughed, and that sound, light and easy, has stayed with me ever since. I repaired her chair carefully, sanded it smooth, and when she came back to pick it up, I asked if she'd like to grab a coffee at Daisy's Diner just down the road. She said yes. We sat there for hours, talking about everything, her students, books, music, and all the small things that make up a life. She listened to me like my words mattered, even though I was just a small-town carpenter who never finished high school. After that, our meetings came as naturally as breathing. We walked by the lake, went to summer fairs, watched outdoor movies in the town square. With Margaret, the world looked softer, brighter. She gave me something I never knew I needed, the feeling that I was worthy of love, not for what I had, but for who I was. Her parents in Birmingham weren't thrilled. They thought an educated woman shouldn't marry a man who spent his days covered in sawdust. But Margaret only said, "I'm choosing him because he's honest." 2 years later, in the fall of 1975, I bought the simplest silver ring the jewelry store had. One afternoon, I took her to the lakeside park where the ground was covered in golden leaves, and I knelt down and said, "Will you marry me, Margaret?" She cried, laughed, and said yes. We got married in January of 1976 at the little wooden church in the center of Cedar Hills. The whole town came to celebrate. People sang, danced, and I still remember the moment she turned to me in that simple white dress, her eyes shining like spring sunlight. That was the day I believed happiness was real, and it was standing right there in front of me. After the wedding, we rented a small house near the town center, just a few blocks from my shop. Life for two young newlyweds was simple to the point of being funny. I worked in the shop all day, had cheese sandwiches for lunch, and every evening Margaret cooked a modest dinner filled with laughter. We didn't have much, but our little home was always scented with fresh cut wood and cornbread in the oven. Margaret kept teaching, while I poured my soul into growing Turner woodworks. At first I made chairs, dining tables, small cabinets, then word spread. I hired an apprentice, bought a bigger saw, and soon that tiny shop started to look like a real business. Every now and then, Margaret would stop by, stand at the door with a smile, and say, "Do you know your face lights up when you're working?" I still remember that line like it was yesterday. In 1979, we welcomed our first child, Daniel. I remember holding him for the first time, my rough hands trembling, afraid I might hurt that tiny life. Margaret smiled, exhausted but radiant. "You'll be a good father, Sam." For I spent my life trying to live up to those words. 4 years later, in 1983, our daughter Clara was born, gentle and bright like her mother. By then, our small house was bursting at the seams, so I started dreaming of building our own home. In 1985, we bought a piece of land on the edge of town, shaded by old oak trees. Every day after work, I built piece by piece, framing, pouring concrete, hammering shingles. Margaret painted walls, chose curtains, planted flowers by the porch. When it was done, the house wasn't big or fancy, but every brick, every beam, carried our sweat and love. Those were the best years of my life. We raised our kids with kindness and example, gathered every evening around the dinner table under a warm yellow light. Daniel showed an early love for mechanics. Clara loved books, just like her mom. On weekends, we grilled in the yard, listened to old country songs, and laughed until the stars came out. Business was good. I began taking bigger jobs, doors, railings, gates for nearby farms, even a few orders from Birmingham. Once Margaret teased, I think you love that workshop more than you love me." I grinned. "I love you, but the shop kept me alive through hard times. The two come together, you know." She just smiled softly and went back to her baking. No words needed. She understood me. The 1990s came quietly. Margaret became the school principal, and I expanded the shop, hiring 3 workers. Daniel helped me after school, learning how to sand and saw. He once said, "When I grow up, I want to do what you do, Dad." I couldn't even speak. I just nodded, proud beyond words. Clara followed her mother's path, always reading, always curious. She once told me, "Daddy, wood smells like home. When I'm away, if I smell it, I'll remember us." I still think that's the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said about family. We weren't rich, but we had enough. Not famous, but respected. Everyone in Cedar Hills knew the Turners, the honest carpenter, and the kind-hearted principal. And I truly believe that if life stayed this way forever, I'd be content till my dying day. But life rarely lets anyone live too long in a season of peace. Back then, I didn't know that those golden years, the years I thought were the start of happiness, were really just the calm before the storm. The first few years after our children grew up were quiet and peaceful. Daniel had graduated and was working as an engineer in Birmingham. Clara followed in her mother's footsteps and became a literature teacher at the same school. The house that once felt crowded now seemed too wide, too silent. Margaret retired when I was 64 after more than 40 years of teaching. On her last day, the school was filled with former students bringing flowers, laughing, crying, thanking her. I stood at the back of the room, watching my wife glowing in the crowd, full of pride. I thought, now we'll finally have time for each other, to travel, visit our kids, enjoy our old age together. And for a while, that's exactly what we did. We walked around the lake every morning, planted flowers in the evenings. But slowly, Margaret began to change. At first, it was nothing alarming. She joined a church book club on Tuesdays, a knitting circle on Thursdays, and volunteered at the community center on weekends. I was glad she had friends and things to keep her busy. But as months passed, something shifted. She started going out more often, coming home later, and I noticed how she began taking more care of her appearance. Darker hair dye, new lipstick, brighter dresses. I teased her once. "Planning to win a beauty contest for retirees?" She laughed softly. "Just trying to feel alive, Sam. I don't want to fade too fast." I didn't see anything wrong in that. Every woman wants to feel beautiful. But what unsettled me was the phone, a thing she used to ignore but now carried everywhere, even into the bathroom. One night I woke up and saw her face lit by the screen in the dark kitchen. "Who were you texting?" I asked. She jumped, startled. "It's Clara. She can't sleep. We're just chatting." The next morning I asked Clara about it, and she looked puzzled. "No, Dad, I was out cold by 9 last night." I said nothing, told myself it's probably nothing, but when nothing keeps happening again and again, it starts to sound a lot like something. One Friday evening, Margaret came home late, saying she'd been at book club. The next day, I ran into Mrs. Ellen, our neighbor who's part of the same group. She mentioned the meeting had been canceled because the host got sick. I just smiled and said, must have misunderstood. But that night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ticking clock, and feeling the weight pressing on my chest. Another evening, Margaret came home wearing a new dress, fancier than her usual style. When I complimented her, she looked uneasy. "The ladies at church talked me into buying it. It was on sale," she said quickly. The words passed easily, but her eyes didn't match her voice. Maybe the hardest part isn't doubting the one you love. It's realizing you no longer trust what used to be unquestionable. I didn't tell anyone, not even the kids. I still cooked dinner, still watched the news with her, still asked, "How was your day?" even though deep down I knew her answer wasn't the truth anymore. I had loved Margaret my whole life, so I chose to believe, even as my heart started hearing the faint sound of cracks forming. In January of 2019, Margaret told me she wanted to sign up for a computer class for seniors in Birmingham. "You know, everything's digital now," she said cheerfully. "I don't want to be left behind." It made sense. I supported her, even offered to drive her to the bus stop twice a week. She went on Tuesdays and Thursdays, claiming the class ran from early afternoon until late evening. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until one phone call changed everything. One afternoon, Ben, an old friend from Birmingham, called me. "Hey, Sam," he said, "I saw you at the bus station today. Why didn't you say hello?" "I've been in Cedar Hills all day," I replied. "You must have seen someone else." Ben hesitated. "That's strange. I saw Margaret there, talking to an older gentleman. I figured you were with her." My hand trembled slightly. "Maybe she was just waiting for her bus," I said, forcing a laugh. But something inside me sank. That night I asked Margaret about her class. She gave perfect answers, names of teachers, classmates, even fake assignments. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were different, distant, like I was looking through fog at a woman who wore my wife's face but wasn't her anymore. Later, when she fell asleep, I opened her purse. No notebook, no papers, nothing about computers. Just a new bottle of perfume, elegant, expensive, unfamiliar. I sat in the dark, listening to the slow ticking of the clock. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't know where my wife was, what she was doing, or who she had become. The following week, I pretended to have back pain and told her I couldn't drive her. "That's fine," she said quickly. "I'll catch the bus at the corner." As soon as she left, I decided to follow her. I asked Daniel, my son, to drive me. I told him I was planning a little surprise for his mom, so he didn't ask questions. We parked a few blocks away and followed the bus toward Birmingham. When it stopped downtown, I saw her get off and walk into a small cafe on Maple Street. Through the window, I saw her sit down across from a silver-haired man, well-dressed and distinguished. He rose, smiled, and leaned down to kiss her gently on the cheek. The sight cut through me like a blade. Margaret smiled, that same soft smile I'd loved for half my life. She leaned forward, said something that made him laugh, and he reached across the table to touch her hand lightly. They sat together, sharing dessert, her eyes glowing with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. My heart clenched painfully. Still, I told myself, it's probably just an old friend, maybe a colleague from school, nothing more. I repeated it again and again, like a prayer to keep the world from falling apart. Daniel looked at me, his voice shaking. "Dad, do you want me to—" "No," I cut him off, eyes fixed on the window. "No need. Let's go home." We drove back in silence. The trees flew past outside, blurred by the tears I refused to let fall. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was the quiet death of something I used to believe would last forever. That night, when Margaret returned, she acted as though nothing had happened. "How was class?" I asked. "Wonderful," she smiled. "We learned typing today." She spoke, I listened, and between us was a silence too deep for words. She kept going to her classes. I kept pretending to believe. But every time she stepped out the door, I knew the woman leaving our house was no longer the one I had loved all my life. Everything came to a head in March of 2020. I was planning to visit my brother Robert in Memphis. His heart condition had worsened, so I arranged to stay for a week. Margaret said she wouldn't go. She had church activities and volunteer work with the ladies' group. I didn't think much of it. By then, she always had her own reasons. The night before I left, she helped me pack, even baked an apple pie to take to Robert. She kissed my cheek and said, "Drive safe, Sam." That night, I couldn't sleep. Something deep inside me whispered, a feeling reason couldn't silence. At dawn, my nephew called. "Uncle Sam, Dad's in the hospital. They're not letting visitors yet. You should wait a few days." I hung up, sat in silence. Then a thought came. What if I didn't tell Margaret the trip was canceled? I'd pretend to go, then come home later as a surprise. Part of me hoped to rekindle something tender, but another part, darker, quieter, needed the truth. I drove off at 6 a.m., made sure the sound of the truck woke her. I circled town for hours, grabbed coffee at the diner, then came back around 3 in the afternoon. I parked down the block and walked quietly to the back gate. It was unlocked. The house was still. "Margaret?" I called softly. No answer. The kitchen was spotless. A cup of coffee sat half-finished on the table, lipstick on the rim. The faint scent of that unfamiliar perfume lingered in the air. I waited. 5 o'clock. 6. No sign of her. I called. Her phone was off. By 7, the sky had gone gray. I drove around town. Church, market, community hall. Nothing. A storm began to rise inside me, made of fear and suspicion tangled together. Back home, I searched her desk. Amid old papers, I found a small notebook. On that Thursday's page, a single word was written. Alan. The name appeared on several previous weeks, always on days she claimed to have classes or meetings. At the back of the notebook was a phone number written in pencil. My hands shook as I dialed. A man's voice answered, deep and calm. "Hello?" I froze, listening to my own heartbeat echo in my ears. "Who is this?" he asked again. I hung up. I sat there in the half-dark, knowing the truth before I even admitted it. Our 45 years together had already turned into a lie. The sky was already tilting toward dusk, the last light of the day staining the window frame gold. I looked around the silent house, the cup of coffee she'd left on the table, the scarf draped loosely over the chair. Everything was familiar, yet suddenly felt distant. A wave of heat rose in my chest, fear mixed with resolve. I couldn't just sit here imagining. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I decided to go to Birmingham. Without telling anyone, I drove off alone, following the same route she always said she took to class. The road to Birmingham stretched nearly 2 hours. I drove almost on autopilot. The scenery slid past the window like fragments of broken memory. Fields, gas stations, old signs. The sky turned a copper red, and my heart pounded as if it might burst. I had no clear plan, only the need to go, to find her. The name in the notebook, Alan, carved itself into my mind like a blade. By the time I reached the city, it was nearly 6 in the evening. I started searching, going from one hotel to another, asking the receptionists if anyone named Margaret Turner or Margaret Wells, her maiden name, had checked in. Most shook their heads. At the 8th hotel, a small place with a flickering neon sign, the young receptionist looked at the photo I showed her and slowly said, "There's no one by the name Turner, but there is a Mrs. Margaret Wells, registered in room 214 with a Mr. Alan Blake." Time stopped. I stood there, barely aware of my own breathing. I nodded, thanked her, and stepped outside. I went to the cafe across the street and waited. The coffee grew cold, but my heart burned like fire. 30 minutes later, Margaret's silver car stopped in front of the hotel. I saw her step out from the passenger seat, her hair fluttering lightly in the wind. The silver-haired man, it was him, wrapped an arm around her back, said something that made her laugh. That smile pierced through me, the smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I sat there, watching them walk into the hotel, my fingers clenched so tightly they drew blood. Then I stood up and crossed the street. The receptionist saw me and gave a small nod. I climbed the stairs, each step heavy as lead. At the door of room 214, I stopped. My knuckles hovered, heart pounding in my throat. Inside, I could hear her laughter, light, clear, painfully familiar. "Alan, you really are unbelievable," she said between bursts of laughter. I knocked. The laughter stopped. Moments later, the door opened slightly. Margaret stood there, eyes wide, hands trembling. "Sam? What are you doing here?" "May I come in?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She stepped aside. Inside, the man stood by the window, looking uneasy. I glanced around. 2 open suitcases, clothes folded neatly. I turned to Margaret. "So this is your computer class?" No one spoke. She lowered her head, tears beginning to fall. "Sam, Enough," I cut her off. "Don't bother. I've seen enough." The man stepped forward, his tone calm. "Mr. Turner, I didn't know you were still alive." I froze. "What did you say?" "She told me you died 2 years ago, that she was a widow." The world around me seemed to stop. I turned to Margaret. She broke down, covering her face with her hands. I wasn't going to let you find out." I gave a dry, hollow laugh. "You told him I was dead? How did I die?" "I said it was a heart attack. I just wanted to live differently for a while. Here, I could be someone else. Not Mrs. Turner, not the teacher's wife. I just wanted to breathe." I shook my head, words failing me. The man stepped back, clearly shaken. I swear I didn't know. I looked at them both, then said slowly, "Thank you for your honesty, even if it came too late." Then I turned and left. No shouting, no breaking things. Just silence, a hush heavier than any scream. I walked out of the hotel without looking back. Outside, rain had begun to fall, washing the dust from the street. But no rain could ever wash away what was inside me, because in that moment I knew the woman I once loved was truly dead. Not because her heart had stopped, but because she had killed my faith with the gentlest lies. I don't remember how I drove back to Cedar Hills that night. The rain poured endlessly, the street lights blurring into long streaks of light. All I knew was that I left Birmingham with a heavy heart and a hollow feeling that no words could describe. When I got home, it was past midnight. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in my truck, listening to the rain tapping against the roof, thinking about the woman I once believed would walk with me to the end of my life. The next morning, I packed a few clothes into an old suitcase, grabbed my papers, and left that house. I couldn't sleep another night under a roof built on lies. I drove to Daniel's house. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, drenched in rain, his face went pale. "Dad, what's going on? Where's Mom?" I sat down, silent for a long time, then said, "Son, it's time you knew the truth." Telling that story to my own child was harder than living through it. I watched his face shift, from disbelief to shock, then anger, then sorrow. "It can't be," he whispered. "Mom wouldn't do that." But I had proof: the notebook, the hotel, the man named Alan. The room fell into a silence that felt suffocating. That evening, Clara came over. She cried, holding me tight, torn between pity and heartbreak. "Dad, why would Mom do this?" I had no answer. 3 days later, Margaret returned. She came to Daniel's house, knowing I was there. When she walked in, she looked worn, pale, but strangely calm. "Sam," she said quietly, "I know you saw everything." I nodded. Yes, and now there's nothing left to say. She cried, said she never meant to hurt me, that things had gotten out of control. But I just stayed silent. Sometimes silence hurts more than anger ever could. A week later, I filed for divorce. She signed without argument, no talk of property, no plea for forgiveness. Just one line: "I hope you find peace." Peace. It sounded like a cruel joke. The news spread through Cedar Hills within days. In a small town, nothing stays secret for long. People looked at me with pity, like I was some old fool who'd been deceived. At the diner, at the store, I heard whispers behind me. There he is, old Turner. His wife ran off. I pretended not to hear, but every word stuck like a thorn. I moved into a small house near the wood shop, a place Daniel helped fix up for me. At first I couldn't sleep. The ticking clock, the rain, the wind slipping through the cracks, all of it reminded me that I was alone now. Time passed. Margaret sold her share of the property and moved to Birmingham. I heard she lived in a small apartment, saw the kids now and then, but I didn't ask. Daniel and Zoe stayed in touch with their mother, and I never stopped them. No matter what she did, she was still their mom. As for me, I filled the emptiness with work. I went back to Turner & Son, the shop Daniel had taken over. I showed up every morning, helped with small jobs, guided the younger workers. Not for money, but because if I sat still, I'd start remembering. Sometimes in the evenings, I walked down to the river where Margaret and I used to fish when we were young. I'd watch the rippling water catch the streetlights and think. Some memories never fade, no matter how much you wish they would. They linger like the smell of burnt steel on a blacksmith's hands, impossible to wash away. A year later, the divorce papers came through. I didn't cry. I just felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally found its place inside me. Time moved slowly, as if the world itself was giving me extra time to heal. In the first days after the divorce, I didn't know what to do with myself. Mornings came without the sound of the kettle boiling, without the smell of Margaret's coffee. Only silence thick enough to hear the wind slipping through the cracks. I tried to fill the emptiness with old routines, going to the workshop, chatting with the young workers, fixing tools, polishing old parts. They called me Old Man Sam, and I smiled. That name felt warmer than Mr. Turner ever did. In the afternoons, I sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the oak trees. The light spread across the fields like a dying ember. I remembered the evenings when Margaret and I used to sit there, hand in hand, saying nothing, just listening to the crickets. Now it was just me and an empty chair. Strangely, after months, the pain began to soften, like a wound that had healed but left a scar. Daniel and Zoe visited often. They tried not to mention their mother, though her name still slipped into their hesitant conversations. I didn't mind. I'd learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about no longer letting the pain rule you. Once, while we were fishing by the river, Daniel asked, "Dad, do you ever think you'll fall in love again?" I chuckled. "Son, at my age, people don't look for love anymore. They look for peace." He laughed, but I could see the pity in his eyes. Truth is, I did receive a few invitations, widows from town, old friends who wanted company at church picnics or Sunday fairs. But my heart had closed, like an old barn door after a storm. Not out of fear, but because I'd found another kind of peace, the kind that comes from expecting nothing, from living quietly for the small, honest things. Every morning I rise early, make coffee, and open the window to let the first sunlight spill into my kitchen. The smell of coffee and wood fills the air. I jot a few lines in my journal, not much, just enough to remind myself that another day has begun, and I'm still here. Sometimes I get postcards from Margaret, a birthday wish, a photo with the grandkids. I don't reply, but I don't throw them away either. I keep them in my desk drawer, not out of love, but because they're part of the life I once had. 5 years have passed since it all fell apart. Now I'm 74, my hair silver, my hands rough, but my heart calm. Now, looking back on the road I've walked, I realize this: no one truly knows what's happening in another person's heart. You can live beside someone for half a century, eat together, sleep together, share everything, and then one day discover that you've only known them in fragments. That's the first lesson life forced me to learn. Never believe you completely understand anyone. People change. Feelings change. And sometimes the very person you trust most is the one who makes you question everything. I've also come to understand something else. The truth may knock you down, but lies will destroy you entirely. I lived in an illusion for years, believing my marriage was as strong as the steel I forged in my workshop. But the truth was as fragile as a layer of rust. One touch, and everything shattered. If Margaret had told the truth that day, just once, perhaps we wouldn't have lost everything. Maybe we still would have separated, but we could have kept our respect for each other. Lies, once they take root, consume both trust and memory. They don't just destroy a relationship, they destroy who you are. I used to ask myself, what does forgiveness mean? Does it mean forgetting? Pretending you were never hurt? No. Forgiveness, I've learned, means releasing the resentment you hold toward yourself. I can't forgive the one who made me lose my faith, but I can forgive myself for not seeing, for trusting, for loving with all my heart. No one is wrong for loving. The only mistake is being too afraid to face the truth. If someone out there is listening to me now, and you're going through a pain like I once did, I just want to say this. Don't live two lives. If you're no longer happy, say it. If your heart has drifted away, be honest with the person beside you. One honest word, though painful, is kinder than 1,000 lies. Because when you choose to lie, you don't just kill love, you bury the best part of yourself alive. I was 69 when everything fell apart, and I thought my life had ended. But I was wrong. It's never too late to start over. The day I left that house, I had nothing but pain and a small suitcase. Yet 5 years later, here I stand, hair grayer, hands shakier, but my heart more peaceful than ever. Peace doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from accepting that some things cannot be saved, but we can still choose how to move forward. I've learned to enjoy a morning cup of coffee without anyone to make it for me. I've learned to talk to myself and to find companionship in silence. I've learned to smile when someone mentions Margaret's name, not with pain, but with a quiet sorrow for what once was. In the end, life is a journey of finding our way back to ourselves, not to someone else, not to the past, but to the person we're still trying to become each day. And if my story makes you pause for a moment and think, then I've done what I hope to do. Because I believe every pain shared becomes a little lighter, and every scar told becomes a lesson for someone else. If you're listening to me now, tell me where you are and what time it is where you are. Let this old man know that somewhere out there are still hearts that are listening.